So, yeah, let's crack on, shall we? This is part 3 of our crafting serial fiction witterings. Part 1 is when we looked at the sort of history of serial fiction and did a very rapid jump through several centuries of history. I hope no historians were actually watching. Part 2 last week, whenever it was, we dived into preparation and planning and all the stuff that is worth doing before you actually start publishing the stuff. So today we are fast forwarding into the writing and publishing phase. I think both of us, like we said last week, we tend to write and publish a bit as we go along. There's different ways of doing it. Certainly, the stuff I'll be talking about today is from the point of view of writing and publishing as I go, rather than having a finished manuscript. But hopefully, the stuff we're talking about is relatively universal anyway. So yeah, that's the plan. And there's people in the chat already. Scoot's in the chat. Anything could happen.
That is true.
Yeah.
Brace yourselves, everyone.
Exactly. So what we thought might make sense, and we'll find out if it does or not, is to go semi-chronologically through the publishing of a serial. So from the sort of early chapters and then through the middle and to the end, and just talk about some of the stuff that comes up along the way at those different stages. Because certainly for me, they feel like quite distinct stages. I think maybe because you're publishing at the same time, it's a bit different to writing a manuscript offline where you can sort of hop around and do whatever you want. But once you've got chapters going out into the world, being in the last quarter of it feels very different to being in the first quarter. I don't know about you, Sally.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. I think, especially because it's such a public thing happening, whether you have a bunch of readers or not. If someone is reading, then the relationship to the project definitely feels a little bit different. So,
yes, yes, exactly. Even if it's one reader, as long as there's one reader showing up, then that's enough to have you start paying attention to what you're doing. So let's talk about getting started, like the very early chapters and what that's like. So I mean, to say up front, all the stuff we're going to be talking about is our experience. It can be wildly different for everybody. And even, I've had different experiences starting a serial, which has not always been the same. So sometimes it's new and exciting, and every week you can't wait to get back to it, and you're sort of discovering cool stuff you weren't expecting. Other times it feels really awkward, and you're sitting there thinking, I don't know if I can do this. Have I picked the right project? What am I going to do? And everything's unfamiliar because you haven't yet settled into whatever the story is going to be. Obviously, if you've built up a buffer, like we talked a bit about last time, that can help, because that buffer will have meant that you've sort of figured out if you like the story yet. You'll have figured out some of that ahead of time. But either way, those early chapters, like the first, it depends on the length of the chapter. For me, it's like the first sort of 10 chapters or so. I'm still kind of figuring out what I'm doing and feeling my way through the story. And because each project is very different, it can feel like you've just gone to a new town and you're kind of not really sure where anything is and no one's given you a map.
Yeah, it feels like those first 2 chapters, for me anyway, they end up doing a lot of the heavy lifting, both for me and potentially for the rest of the story, because I think of it like a pilot episode. I know I think in TV a lot, but I think of it like, you need to set up the people that are important, the world, essentially, like kind of the beginnings of the world that you're inhabiting, and an inkling of what the problem is going to be, the conflict. Like, even if you're not actually launching into the conflict right in the first episode, it still feels like there should be some sense of how the world is going to turn upside down, which is very different than writing a novel, because it really does feel like in a novel, maybe not so much these days because the novel has kind of changed a lot, but you can kind of have the first, I don't know, 3 or 4 chapters of a novel be set up, just like getting everything, kind of easing into everything and setting up the world as it's supposed to be before everything goes topsy-turvy. But the first episode or 2 of a serial kind of needs to start so that people know what it is that they're going to be following, especially if you're making them wait week to week, then like there
Mm.
kind of needs to be that springboard into whatever's coming next. And so that can feel like a lot of pressure. It can be exciting if it is an exciting new project, because I've definitely had serials where the idea is really what's like the fire under me to get it started, you know, and I'm just like super hyped to get those first couple chapters out. Um, but it also can be difficult when, yeah, you don't necessarily have the whole thing yet. And so you're kind of like, I am also telling myself this story right now, and I'm not entirely sure how much runway I have to make it exciting, you know,
Yeah.
before it like continues into the middle, you know?
Yeah, definitely. And I think also potentially you might be trying out a new style, like a different way of writing, a different narrative point of view and structure. So it could, be a very different experience to previous books. I really liked when you described it as like a pilot episode for a TV show. Like I think we've talked a lot in sort of analogous terms to television, which I suppose for maybe the more sort of literary fiction uh, crowd might be kind of like making them like cringe a little bit. But I think from a structural perspective, like the actual contents of the text can be whatever you want it to be, but structurally it helps to think in those terms. And yeah, the pilot episode thing's really interesting because obviously if someone is reading a novel and they've got the book, ebook or print book, they've got the whole thing already. So like you say, that you can take as long as you want, really, as long as it's compelling in some way, you can take a long while to kind of get on with it, I suppose. Whereas if you're putting out one chapter and then there's nothing for a week, like that chapter has to do something interesting. So, um, I think we've probably talked about cliffhangers a little bit already, but how do you get people coming back? Once you're into the story and people are into it, that becomes a slightly different thing, which we'll probably get to. But at the start, there's literally nothing for them to hang on to. Like the reader has no idea what this thing is. So that first chapter, that first part has to do something to get them to come back for the second part. If they come back for the second part, then you're in a better position, I think. But that first bit is tricky. And yeah, I remember when I was doing Tales from the Triverse, figuring out what the first chapter was going to be was quite hard because I really wanted to drop straight in with the first sort of detective case and have it feel like a sort of 1970s Martin Scorsese style kind of fairly gritty scenario. And then at the end, you have a sudden rug pull and you realize there's like dragon things and it's actually a fantasy. But then the kind of 3 world setup of Triverse is quite convoluted if you don't know what's going on. So that's why I actually ended up doing a kind of prologue type chapter that set the scene a little bit because it established some of those essential rules. Because without those, it was quite hard to enjoy the detective fiction without having any idea of what the hell was going on. So it's like
Yeah.
it's bits like that where you're trying to like how much information like does the audience need, and figuring out like what is the minimum information they need just to have any idea of enjoying it.
Yeah. And I will say I have a lot more grace for not too much, but like for expository blocks of text in a serial because I think, yeah, for the sake of pacing, it's perfectly normal to kind of like backfill for your audience. Like I'm saying that as someone who has done it. So maybe there's some people who don't like that. But I will say like, when I started my serial freelance and Fishmaids, I had already written some short fiction featuring those characters. And so I had a group of people who were reading that serial knowing who these people were already, or at least a couple of the characters. But I had another group of people who probably hadn't read my short fiction, and so they were starting it new. And so I think having some strategic blocks of text to just kind of say like, as you know, Bob, here's just a quick little like primer on what's going on so that for the sake of clarity, we can continue, right? And I think it would be clunky in a novel, which is why I'm trying to iron some of that stuff out now as I'm turning it into a novel. But like in a serial, it's okay to I think it's okay to have a little bit of that because you don't want the pacing to suffer while you're doing flashbacks or while you're doing like let's go back and explain all of this stuff first so that you all know what's going on before we continue. It's like, no,
Hmm.
just give us the highlights. Like, what are the bullet points? Let's just,
Yeah.
let's get going. Yeah. It's
Yeah,
the opening
definitely.
narration in a TV show of just like, you know, the world was like this. Now it's like this. Let's go.
Off we
Kind of
go.
thing.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
it's interesting because you can very much split that out if you want into your kind of like previously on like blurb at the very start. So it's not even part of the actual like main story, the text of the story. It's kind of a separate thing. Or you can weave it into dialogue and into description and have recaps that way. And I think trying to figure out which way each writer wants to do that is something to think about, because particularly if you have a long running serial. So my serial went for like 4 years. So like the most committed reader, if I reference something in year 4 that was in year 1, like they're not going to remember that without a little nudge. Which if they'd just been reading like a finished novel for a few days or weeks, that'd be fine. So yeah, you do have to drop in some reminders here and there,
And
for
also,
sure.
I would also just add here, even though I probably could wait until we talk about this later, but I think it's relevant here too. I think it's okay as well to trust your readers with Easter eggs that are fun, but they're not necessary for the sake of the plot. So, I mean, I write a lot of my fiction in this shared location, this island
Mhm.
location in the invented island I made up. And I like to throw in little winks and nods for the people who've been reading for a long time as a reward for being part of it. But like, I try to make sure none of those things are necessary to know. Like, it's not like something you need to know to understand the story. It's just, here's a character that you've probably seen before, and we're just going to have them walk on and have a cameo, and then they're going to walk off again. And the people who
Yeah.
know are going to go, yay! And the people who don't know are going to go, okay, cool.
Yeah.
And I think it's okay to have a little bit of that too, and like be able to play with
Hmm.
that, as long as it's not something that is going to break people's brains if they need to know it and they don't have the information.
Yeah, it's that difference, isn't it, between sort of reward slash Easter egg and homework,
Yeah.
and where that line is
Yeah.
quite tricky sometimes to figure out, because ideally you want a new reader to just not even notice it and have no idea what's going on and just
Yeah.
enjoy the story in the now. But then, like you say, long term readers are like, "Ah, it's that guy," and they get really excited. Um,
Yeah.
and you can sort of see this in some of the big franchise movies over
Mm,
the years, which have tipped more and more towards the homework side of things. So that,
mm,
a new Marvel film comes out and you have to have watched 6 other movies and 3 TV shows and watched this other thing over here. And it all gets a bit too complicated. Whereas when you stick to the more Easter egg reference thing, that casual readers can basically ignore it. And then the most enthusiastic people get something a little bonus. But yeah, it's very easy to tip the wrong way on that, I think.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, in terms of the very, very beginnings, uh, something I was thinking about is, and I think in the future chat, we're going to get into promotion and trying to find audiences and that kind of thing. But at the very start, there's kind of 2 ways you could go with a serial. One of which is to shout about it and treat it like a book launch and go really big and be like, I'm starting this thing, like go and jump on board on chapter 1. But the other thing you could do is just have a soft launch and be just very quietly send out the first chapter, even the second chapter, and just take your time, ease into it. So it depends very much how you're feeling about your story, like how confident you are, how much of a buffer you've got, or whether you've settled into it or not, because it's really up to you how you approach that angle of things. Like you don't have to go one way or the other. And I think a big part of navigating through a serial as a writer is figuring out what kind of a writer you are and like how much noise you want to make, in a way, because if you do too much and you're not really comfortable with it, that's going to add a load of stress that you probably don't want.
Yeah.
Uh,
It's sort of the pre-order versus just release question, right?
mhm.
Like, yes, doing a pre-order for a book can give you an idea of how many people are excited for your book, but it also comes with responsibilities because your book better be ready by the time the pre-order is launched. Otherwise, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
Versus just kind of releasing something and then letting people know about it, right? And I think, yeah, it really is up to each individual writer, and it's up to your confidence level. I think hype is just a whole monster that I'm not even sure we can really get into here. It would take our entire hour to talk. But I think like types of hype and how you do it and how you go about it, people tend to overthink it, people tend to underthink it. I just think what I would say is that don't be disappointed if your first few chapters don't have a lot of hype around them. Like that doesn't mean that your serial is doomed to fail. You're not gonna like it's a long project and there's a lot of time for people to get on the on ramp. So yeah, I would say, like you said, start it with the amount of enthusiasm that you feel comfortable maintaining, I guess is what I
Yeah.
would say.
Yeah, don't be
Yeah.
pressured into like doing more than you want to. Because the other thing with the serial is that every chapter is essentially its own mini book launch. So, if you actually release a book, you sort of have to get the launch right because getting momentum on it after that is much harder. Whereas with the serial, like every week you're putting out a new thing, and that's another opportunity to say, "Here's a new thing," and get loads of new people checking it out, and they might just read that or go back to chapter one or what have you. So you kind of repeatedly over the course of the serial have a chance to be going back to people all the time and reaching new people. So all the way through the run, there's opportunities to make it bigger and reach more people and see what's going on. So yeah, like you say, if chapter one goes out and nobody's there, and no one shows up, doesn't really matter because that's it's not a catastrophic thing like it might be if you had a book launch and you went to a bookshop to do signings and no one showed up, which would be sad.
Exactly. Yeah.
So in terms of do's and don'ts, I think my first sort of thing to do is stick to the schedule. Um, like you want to do this throughout, but particularly at the start, you just want any readers that are showing up, you want them to know that this is going to be a thing they can rely on, that's going to regularly pop up in their inbox and not just sporadically appear in a confusing way. I think that's my number one, I suppose. We talked last time, I think, about making it easy for people to jump on board. So, that's like getting your welcome email sorted, making sure that there's useful navigation things, regardless of whether you're using a platform like Wattpad or doing it yourself through a newsletter, just making sure that people can find the stuff. And, if they do encounter chapter 3, like, is it easy for them to go and hop back to the start or figure out what the story is and that kind of
Yeah.
stuff?
And actually, I saw in the chat somebody asked kind of an infrastructure question about whether you separate out your fiction from other things. I
Mhm.
would say for the ease of people being able to, for readers being able to unsubscribe from certain aspects, I actually do personally give each serial its own section on my newsletter so that I can toggle it on or off and people can toggle it on. If they're just not interested in getting serial chapters and would rather get short stories from me or whatever,
Yeah.
it's just easier. But if that's not something you're super comfortable understanding yet on Substack, I understand not doing that. But I would just say like that is a possibility. If you don't want your entire newsletter to be focused on serials, there's ways of separating that out. So,
Yeah. And I think
yeah.
particularly with something like a newsletter where you are much more in control, like as the creator, giving readers options so that they can customize their experience is a good thing to do, because what you don't want is to sort of force everyone to have everything, because the end result of that is probably that they just leave entirely. Whereas if you give them the flexibility over time, you're going to have a better audience that is kind of more sculpted around what you're doing. Uh, and something that's a hard thing to learn about the newsletter game generally, is that uh, unsubscriptions from your newsletter is not a bad thing, because generally if someone's unsubscribing, then they're not particularly interested in your stuff, and that can feel quite harsh, but actually having them on the newsletter wasn't going to be doing anything anyway. So you're always going to be gaining some subscribers, losing subscribers, and hopefully you're getting more than you're losing. But either way, over time your subscription base gets better and better, like
Yeah.
through those two things happening.
Yeah, churn is normal. It's so normal. And in fact, churn shows that you've got a living newsletter. Like that's part of how newsletters operate is people jumping on and people jumping off. So,
Yes, exactly,
yeah.
exactly. What else? So yeah, things not to do. I think it's very easy at the start because you're really excited about this new project you're doing to bombard people's inboxes. Either because you write chapter 1, you're like, oh, that was amazing, I'm going to do chapter 2 straight away and send it out the next day or something. So you don't want to be kind of sporadic when you're sending stuff out, but also, if you're sending additional information, if you're doing behind the scenes stuff, just, be a bit restrained in terms of how much you're bombarding people, because that's even if they're enjoying something, if you're getting too much of a good thing, then yeah, that can be off-putting, I think.
Yeah. I personally prefer, and then again, this is very much a preference. So I'm not saying anything to anyone who prefers doing it a different way, but I prefer letting the story speak for itself as much as possible and letting behind the scenes stuff or character profiles or stuff like that be, I mean, few and far between. I think sometimes people mistake character profiles and behind the scenes stuff as a way of getting people to fall in love with your story and your world. And in my experience, the story is what will make people fall in love with your story and your world, not just a list of traits of a character, you know? And like, it can be fun, like, especially if certain people have more of a visual component. Like, I've never had that, but some people do have like really cool world building or they have different species of things. And so they do these, like, they have illustrations or whatever. That's awesome. And I think I don't have that. So I can't speak to that. But I will say, like, just if it's just a story, like, where they're, it's all humans or whatever, like, you don't have any extra components going on, it's okay to let the story happen and not try to shortcut, reader affection using, like, a lot of extra stuff. That's just my
Yeah.
opinion. But
I
I
think I agree with that.
yeah.
Yeah, I think it's sort of the other way around almost. Like, once people are actually interested in the story on its own merits, then potentially you can make their experience even better by providing some of that stuff. But I've never really experienced it myself, that kind of supplementary material and bonus stuff and illustrations and like fun side lore stuff, like, that doesn't attract new people to it, I don't think, because like, I mean, you get some people who are well into lore, like they just love lore no matter what, like more so than the actual thing itself. But I think most readers like just want a good story, and then they might like to delve into the lore separately later on. Um, yeah, I feel like it's like nobody reads the Lord of the Rings appendices and then thinks, "Oh, that was cool. I'm going to go and read the story now." Like, that's not the way around. It tends to happen.
Well, I would even be more, like, blunt about it and say nobody feels full after reading a recipe. It's like
Yeah,
you want to eat the thing. You don't want to just like see a list of traits and go, oh, that sounds good. Like,
yeah,
I'd like to see it in action, please. That kind of
yeah. Exactly. Um, so yeah, that's the beginnings. And although it's potentially quite a scary thing to do, to actually start putting stuff out into the world. I mean, one benefit of potentially having small readerships at the start is that it does reduce the fear factor. Like, your audience can scale with your confidence in the book to a certain degree. Um, but then the next phase, I've written down here, I called it the hump. And I think
thing.
this is not unique to serials. This is that kind of 20% of the way into a project, or sometimes it's like 10,000, 20,000 words into writing a novel or whatever it may be. Uh, it's the bit where you've got past that initial excitement and just that kind of like uh, the the kind of red hot like excitement of just going through it, because everything is new and thrilling, and you've got through that, but you've still got a lot of story to do. um, and that's often when projects can get abandoned. I think there's probably a lot of writers who have 20,000 word chunks of novels in drawers that never went beyond that. Uh, Now, if you're publishing a serial, so you've already started putting it out there, like we said last time, the worst thing you can do is to not finish it. Because if you don't finish a serial, then nobody's going to want to come back to check out your next one because they're not going to have any confidence that the story will actually end. So yeah, I think this is the risky moment. And I don't know how do you encounter this, Sally? And if you do, like, what do you do about it?
So what I call it is the chapter 3 cliff. Chapter 3 or 4 is usually where a couple of different things happens. One, you're in the story, so the initial infatuation phase is starting to wear off and you're like, "Oh, okay, I actually have work to do." Like
Yeah,
all the setup is done and now it's work time. The other thing that happens around this time is I've just noticed this is kind of universal with serials. Around chapter 3 or 4 is when the readers that you do have might start lagging in their readership, right? Because they're busy people, they've got a full, their initial excitement also starts to wane. And we're going to talk more about engagement in a future part of this, but um I will say like that feedback or like lack of feedback can definitely hit the writer as well, where you start
yeah,
noticing people aren't opening it as quickly around chapter 3 or 4 or after that, or there's just you're not getting that same quick like wow that you were getting before, if you were getting it right. And so that's why, yeah, I always, now having done this a few times, I try to prepare myself for that moment. And a lot of it does come down to making sure that your outline is solid, making sure that all that prep work that you did is as much as you could possibly do. And also, I don't really have a good way of like procedurizing this to explain it, but making sure that you have some like treats and candy bars along the way for yourself in the writing that you're excited to get to, right? Because the middle is long. No matter what project you're writing, even in my 12-part serials, the middle is a lot of episodes, like it's a long lawn to cross. And making sure that there are certain scenes that I've built in that I'm looking forward to, like little
yeah.
things along
Like,
the way
can't
that
wait to
like,
get to that bit.
yeah, like that's, I think that is a huge help when you start hitting that friction and you're like, oh no, like I actually have to keep writing this thing, don't I? It can help to have those little things that will make you excited to get to the next part.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, I know when I'm writing, sometimes I've got this kind of like slightly mischievous like feeling because I know what's coming up like 2 weeks away, and the readers have no idea. And yeah, that like kind of secretly knowing what's coming up, like someone's told you like the spoilers, which sounds slightly mad because it's your own story, but you're kind of like ha ha ha. It's good. Like if you read it's like if you've read a book or watched a TV show or something, and then a friend of yours starts reading or watching it, and you're like, yeah, they're
Yeah.
nearly up to episode 10.
Exactly. Yeah. I think it can just be such a helpful, it adds that extra engagement for yourself because you should also be having fun as much as possible. Obviously, a lot of serializing is work and it's going to be work no matter what you do. Like there's no way to have it just be a breeze. Even if you do write it ahead of time and you're posting it chapter by chapter, there's still going to be work involved, and making sure that you have fun with it is really important, I think. So,
Yeah, I think figuring out the amount of sort of planning and plotting you want to do, because it's around this point, once you got past the exciting start, this is when it can feel like just a process. And like every week you're coming back to do another chapter. And that's when you really notice like, oh, this is the same thing every week. And it does feel a bit more like a job.
yeah.
Because, no matter how much you love writing, there are points where you just have to sit down and do the thing and it can feel like a bit of a slog. And I think part of that, if you're writing and publishing as you go, sometimes that can be due to planning a bit too much.
Yeah.
Certainly in my experience, like if I'm just basically looking at my plan and then being like, oh, I'm writing that scene now. Okay. Okay. And just sort of almost transcribing your own brain. So you don't get that sense of discovery. So if you're feeling a bit like that, loosening up and just being like, well, okay, I know I want to get over here by 5 chapters time, but how I get there, I'm actually going to throw out that stuff and just see what happens. So you
Yeah.
still know where you're going, but the route you take to get there could be more interesting.
And also, I will say I have used like NaNoWriMo cheat codes to get myself excited for a certain chapter. I just mean that like I used to spend a lot of time on the NaNoWriMo forums and people would come up with all kinds of ways to keep going. And like
Hmm.
some of my favorites are, if you have like I have the Storymatic card deck. And sometimes if
Okay,
I'm
yeah,
just not sure how to get started on a chat, I'll like just pull a card and tell myself, okay, I have to work this card into whatever I'm doing next. Even if it's just like a passing mention, it just gets you moving, right? It's just something to like jog you loose. Or shout out to Scoot. He's got the Flash Fiction Friday stuff that he does every week, and those are great. So you can go over to Scoot's place over on Fridays, and he has great prompts. Yeah, just anything that or even just like picking a word from the dictionary or the encyclopedia. Like I know it sounds stupid, but like finding something that throws a wrench in can help you to make that outlining that you did a little bit softer and a little bit more fun and exciting and just kind of yeah. We need we need a kick every so often. We need something to surprise us, and especially those of us who are plotters, because I know you and I are both plotters, and like it can just really help to have something come out of nowhere. And
yeah,
I've had whole plot points in my serials come from pulling a Storymatic card or like something random like that because it kind of adds that extra thing that makes you go, oh, I didn't actually think about what if they did this instead, or like what if they, it's letting your brain make those connections that it wouldn't have made
yeah,
otherwise. And
yeah.
I
And
think that's part of the
injecting that new thing in can be
yeah,
like a bit scary, but really exciting because you're not quite sure what the ramifications is going to be. And
yeah,
particularly if you're writing a serial over a long period of time, stuff's going to be happening in your own life, stuff's happening on the news. You're going to be reading other things, which is all going to be giving you new ideas during the process of writing your book, which, if you stick rigidly to the plan that you put together 6 months prior or 3 months, 3 years earlier, or however long your project is, like you're not the same person as you were back then. So you have to kind of allow it to shift and move over time. Also, I like that you made it sound like everyone literally goes around Scoot's house on a Friday.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. That's
is
it.
he
We all hang out.
is he experiencing this? Yeah,
Well, and I will say, like, um, not to be afraid of plot cul-de-sacs. I think that's one of the reasons why people get worried about doing that kind of stuff is because they worry that they'll take a subplot won't go anywhere, or they'll get kind of stuck on something. It happens to everybody,
yeah,
whether you plan or
yeah.
not. It happened to me in my last serial, and I sat on that chapter for longer than I meant to go, how do I get myself out of this? I just walked myself into something I didn't mean to walk into. And it's okay. My husband is former British military, and he always says, like, you're lost before you know you're lost, right? Like at a certain point, you have to just like stop and turn around and go, okay, the day has changed. We gotta we gotta rearrange here. And readers are forgiving. I would say don't necessarily feel like you have to explain too much outside of the story. Just do what you have to do to get yourself through it. Just like it's okay. And this is a public first draft, right? I think most people who are reading serials understand that they're reading a public first draft. So there are going to be cul-de-sacs, there are going to be subplots that don't go anywhere. And like, yes, you might have some comments of people being like, "Hey, what happened to the thing?" And it's like, well,
What thing? What are you talking about? Don't know.
yeah.
Yeah, um,
You never saw it. I don't
yeah.
know what you're
I think also if you just carry on with confidence, um,
Mhm.
like readers quite often won't notice because a lot of the sort of glitches in the story, or where you're like, oh, I shouldn't have done that, or I've gone down a weird plot hole, all of those sort of things. Like that's probably really obvious to you as the writer, but a lot of readers aren't going to spot it. It's the same if a musician is performing on stage and like plays a couple of wrong notes, like 90% of the audience is going to have no idea. But if the musician stops and goes, "Oh no, I played the wrong notes," then everyone notices. So it kind of depends how
Yeah.
you roll with it a little bit.
Yeah, don't apologize ahead of time for the thing you're about to serve.
Yeah,
Like, just
exactly.
put it out there. Just, like, let
Only
it
only
let it be.
apologize when someone notices. Is that
Yeah.
what we're saying? Is
Yeah,
that a rule for life? I
exactly.
don't know. Mm. I'm
Yeah.
not sure that's what I'd tell my son to do, but yeah, in terms of serial fiction writers, for sure.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. What else? Oh, yeah, some other things that you can potentially do, I think. I mean, one thing is to recognize that everyone feels like this. So don't beat yourself up. It's like the most normal thing of doing a big project. But if you really need to take a break in some way, like I know we've said, like, it's really important to stick to the schedule and like don't stop, don't abandon the project, all that kind of stuff. But realistically, in terms of people looking after their own health and stuff, like if it's really like just getting into your head and you're not enjoying the process, like there are things you can do without actually fully abandoning the project. So if you build in the concept of like season breaks, for example, like that could help, so that, again, a bit like television, you have like season 1, season 2, and you maybe have a few weeks in between seasons, but you do that as a deliberate thing to give yourself some breathing space. You could do that kind of thing. You could just do a couple of shorter chapters. Just cut yourself some slack and do a couple of weeks where it's just shorter chapter. It's a bit easier. Again, readers probably aren't going to really mind. And as long as it still works for the story, then if it's proving really hard to get 5,000 words out every week, then just cut yourself a bit of slack again. And something I did with Triverse, particularly if I was doing a lot of planning and I was still figuring out what I was going to do down the line, that's when I would maybe come in, like we were saying, with a bit of the kind of bonus chapters and like the sort of lore type stuff. So if I wasn't quite ready to drop the next main chapter, I'd just do like a mock-up newspaper front page or something, which looks kind of cool and it's fun for readers, but actually there's hardly any words on it relative to a normal chapter. So it's a bit of a breather for me while still delivering something kind of cool. And
Yeah.
it doesn't look like me taking a week off, but actually it gives me a lot of space. So that there's little things you can do around the edges so that you don't actually go mad.
Yeah, I think something I try to encourage everyone in just in Substack in general, in writing in general, is not to see everything around us as an adversary to be overcome. I think writers can have a very adversarial view of their work or of their readers or whatever. Your readers are there because they want to read your work and they want to trust you and they want to enjoy hanging out with you, essentially, and your voice, right? That's why Substack is so cool and why it's so unique and why serials can feel so unique in that way. And so, like, if the main thing is just to communicate. Like, if you're really having a rough time, I think in every serial I've written, I've taken at least 1 week off, where I've just had to say, like, "Hey, lifed this week." And people, I
Yeah.
have never had anyone be mad at me for that. Like, maybe they're quietly mad at me, but they're not saying it to me. And I mean, even with my last serial, Smoke Mouth just got off the rails so fast, and my readers were so gracious. And I'm sure I lost some people along the way who were just finally like, "I can't keep up with what you've got going on." But as much as possible, I just tried to keep communicating and keep saying, like, "It's coming, I promise. We're figuring it out." One thing that helped with Smoke Mouth was I had one, like I said, that plot cul-de-sac I got myself into. Getting myself out of it required writing one chapter from a different perspective,
Yeah.
which I don't normally encourage unless it's, like, gonna be part of your part of the project. But in that case, it actually really helped me to jog loose. It was almost like I was just so laser focused on this one perspective that it helped to kind of go over here and do something over here, and then it reminded me the stakes of the story again. It was kinda
Yeah.
like, "Okay, alright, I can get back into this because I'm reminding myself of what's at stake here?" So, yeah, I think there's a lot more margin than you think there is, and readers on the whole are very gracious people, and they want your work, your good work. They don't want your stressed out,
Yeah.
freaked out work.
No,
Like, I have
exactly. That point of view trick is a really good one. And that's like last week we talked about how you need to think up front what the sort of narrative structure of your story is going to be. Like, is it a first person thing? Is it third person? Are you jumping between viewpoints or sticking to one particular one and all that kind of stuff? Um, And I think, writing something in first person that sticks to that point of view character for the whole story can be quite intense as a writer, like to stick with that. So, one factor, obviously you have to pick what works for the story you're telling, but also if you are able to tell a story that is structured with multiple viewpoints, you can then do what you've just said, which is, if you're finding a character tricky, or if their particular storyline is proving problematic, or you just need a change, you can just hop character in the next chapter and tell a completely different story. Like essentially, you start off on a different track. And so if that's going to be something that could be useful to someone as a writer of a long form serial, you have to think about that at the start so that you can, your structure allows you to do that,
Yeah.
rather than it kind of breaking what you're doing. Because that
Yeah.
definitely helped me with Tribe Us.
It can also be a little bit of a fast travel trick as well. Like if you need time to pass, like you didn't
Hmm.
think you did, but you need there to be a little bit of a time jump,
Yeah.
having a change of perspective can help. It's just kind of like, okay, and it's a month later. All right, here we go. So
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And yeah, like we said, ultimately, don't worry too much about your readers. Despite all the stuff we said about being consistent and getting the chapters out and all that kind of stuff, because ultimately readers are probably there because they're interested in what you do generally, not just specifically that story. Because if they were just there for one particular story, they're more likely to be the kind of reader that goes to a bookshop and buys a book, I think. If you've ended up subscribing to a weird newsletter by a particular writer, then you're interested in that writer, I think. So yeah, people are kind generally, I think, is what we're saying.
yeah,
um,
yeah,
so if you get over the hump, like get past that tricky kind of quarter of the way in type thing, then you end up with like the long slump, that the middle. It's like, it's not the start. You've got past the really tricky bit where everyone abandons projects. You're not yet at the end. It's just all the rest of it. And you just got this whole load of story that you have to do before you get to the end of it. Which I'm making it sound terrible, but depending on the size of the project, it can be a bit daunting because you've done the tricky bit of starting, but now you've just got this like infinite thing ahead of you. Well, not infinite, but it being a weekly
yeah,
serial potentially. If you
yeah,
know you've got 50 chapters to go, you're like, oh, that's a whole year of doing this. Um,
yeah,
and yeah, you can very much plot it on your upcoming life and see how much it's going to impact you, which is hard.
yeah, yeah. I think obviously I that's partially why I keep my serials short because
Yes.
a messy middle that's only 6 or 7 episodes long doesn't feel quite as scary as 50 episodes. But yeah, I think for me the trick, again, a lot of it's the preparedness at the beginning. But even if you haven't done a bunch of work at the start, something that just is so helpful is to have your characters' motivations and themes, your story's themes as this lodestar that keeps bringing you back, right? Um, because yeah, it can feel like a lot of story has to happen, and it can get really easy to like when middles start to flag. I think it's often because characters aren't motivated enough. I'm speaking as both a writer and a reader. It's if your characters aren't active, then yeah, it's gonna feel like a slog because you feel like you're literally just picking them up and moving them from place to place, and you're inventing reasons for them to move,
Yeah.
and like that is tiring. It's tiring. Anyone who's worked with children knows, or has children themselves, knows how difficult it is to make someone who does not want to move go over there. And so I think like characters are like children in that way. Like you want them to think it's their idea. So as much as possible, yeah, I think having the themes of your story pretty firm in your head and having your characters be as motivated as possible. Just keep coming back to what do they want? Like what do they want and what do they secretly need that they don't know that they need? And the more you can come back to those two questions, the easier it is to keep realigning yourself on that path, so that you're, even if you do kind of go over there for a little bit and kind of wander and stuff, you can keep coming back to like, okay, this is
Yeah.
what we're supposed to be doing. And that will make the middle feel much less sloggy, I think. At least it has for me.
Yes, because the middle is when it's very easy to start paying too much attention to your plot, and rather than it being a story, it turns into a sequence of events that happen one after another, which doesn't really flow. But yeah, I think what you said about if you've got your characters clear and you've got your themes clear, like leaning into them and focusing on them as your sort of compass and to show you the direction through the story, that's more important than sticking to every plot beat that you had in your head. And as long as you're heading in the general direction you wanted to go in, allowing the theme to emerge everywhere and allowing the characters to do what would make sense for those characters. If that means like jettisoning or changing some plot points that are coming up, then I think that's worth doing. Because the other way around, where you stick to the plot points that you put down in your plan, but that means your characters have to, as you say, be kind of forced from A to B. That very rarely turns out well for anyone.
Yeah. Yeah. It's only the kind of thing that really works well in, like, I'm thinking of like old westerns like Rawhide and stuff like that, where it's like, yes, the whole thing starts with them having to do something because something is happening to them, right? And like, sure, that can be fun to read about if the characters are fun anyway. But yeah, I think in an arc of a story, constantly forcing your characters to do things, it just gets exhausting, because again, you have to keep coming up with that stuff and it doesn't feel organic. Like, I think we've all read or watched stuff where you just feel like the character is just a blob who's kind of who's kind of falling or like lucking into things. And it's like, that's not fun to watch. Like, we want to see them make decisions and make mistakes. And like, that's actually half the fun, is having a flawed enough character that they can make mistakes. Like, let them be flawed. Like, let them get themselves into messes and have to clean it up. Like, that's actually kind of part of the fun of a good character, is watching that spiral of them making a decision and having to deal with the consequences of it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think, it's so clear in a story when characters are being like shoved around the board against their will. Because I think when it's working, you don't even think about it. You don't notice it because you're in the story. But as soon as you have those moments where you're like, don't see why they wouldn't do that. That seems a bit strange. Or someone says something that just seems entirely unlikely. Like it's so obvious. And you don't have to be a writer for that stuff to be obvious. Like readers or viewers or what have you immediately pick up on it. And they might not put their finger on it as to what's just happened, but they know something weird, just like the story just jumped off the tracks, basically.
Yeah. I think a lot of it comes out in characters acting out of character. Like,
Yeah.
you see them doing something and you go, why did they do that? They would never have done that, and it's because
Mm-hmm.
it's author intervention, like,
Yeah.
because they have to, so
Yeah.
yeah.
I think the worst culprit is when a character does something really stupid, like really daft, particularly if their character is supposed to be, like, ultimate professional, whatever, like whether it's, action hero or something, and they just do something completely daft because the plot needs them to do it in order to get to the next scene. But
Yeah.
yes, so yeah,
Yeah.
don't do that. And I think at this point as well, because you've got this thing stretching out ahead of whether it's a shorter serial or a really long one, it's going to feel huge anyway. And I think same with a novel. If you sit down before you start writing and think of a novel, it's this like monolithic, terrifying thing, and you can't imagine how you're ever going to complete it. Whereas a chapter of a novel or of a serial is quite doable. You can do like one chapter at a time. And if you're in that middle section and everything's feeling like it's quite heavy and getting on top of you, like just focus on the chapter and the next bit, and don't worry too much about what's down the line. Because if you just keep doing one chapter after another, you will inevitably, almost by accident, end up at the end at some point. Whereas if you're kind of trying to take in the entire project at all times, it can could be quite scary.
Yeah, I think I've definitely had weeks where I've been working on a chapter and I've had to say to myself, you know what? I'm just going to work on this and it's next week's problem. Like next week Sally is going to have to figure out how to solve this particular issue. And I jokingly say that, but at the same time I've found that by next week the solution usually presents itself. Like we can just get so laser focused on this one issue that if you just say to yourself, you know what? I'm not going to solve that right now. I'm going to just get this out, be happy with it, and deal with the consequences next week. And lo and behold, a lot of the time next week, there is an answer that you didn't see because you were so focused on this one chapter. So yeah, I think you're right. Just taking it one step at a time really is the only way. And like, sure, having an eye toward the end, especially if you have some things outlined and stuff like that, but not being so closed-handed about that you can't allow yourself to just say like, "Hey,
Yeah.
it is what it is right now." It just has to go out and I have to be happy with this right now, whatever this is.
Yeah,
Just present
definitely.
moment.
And that kind of makes sense when you think about a serial in terms of an episodic approach as well, because this isn't just another chapter in a book. Like it's a standalone piece of storytelling
Yeah,
to a greater or lesser degree, and it has to work on its own merits. Even if it's chapter 35 of a 50 chapter thing, like for your readers who are showing up in that week, you want them to get a satisfying little slice of story. So just focusing on that and not worrying too much about the scary stuff that's coming up at you down the tracks is not a bad way to think about it. And something you also said then, where if you're not quite sure how you're going to get out of this thing, but that's a problem for next week. Something I've really found over the years is that most of my best ideas come during the writing process and in between writing sessions. So something I sort of push back on a little bit is the common writing advice that you should write every day.
yeah,
Obviously, if somebody wants to write every day, that's totally cool, and if it
sure.
works, brilliant. But I actually find quite a lot of value in not writing every day, but I'm thinking about the story every day. But actually, the weekly cadence of a serial works really well for me because it builds in a little gap in between. So I'll write a chapter and publish it, and then I'll take a day or two before I start actively working on the next one. But quite often, by the time I get to that, I've come up with a bunch of new ideas that I didn't have the previous week,
Yeah,
and that kind of keeps repeating itself all the way through. So the ideas that I'll get in week 40 or something are way better than I was getting in week 20. But if I'd spent another 6 months in the planning stage of the project trying to work out all those details, I'd never have thought of it. It's only when you're in the middle of it that it actually works.
yeah. I'm a huge believer in letting your subconscious chew on things. I had a teacher in high school who used to say when you sit down, of course we had paper tests back then. I'm sure kids don't have that anymore. But when you sit down with your paper test or quiz to read the entire packet first before you make any marks on anything. Because her theory was, I don't know how true this is, but her theory was that like your brain is already going to be chewing on the questions that you haven't gotten to yet. So by the time you get to those questions, you'll have something to write down. And I have taken that and run with it in my own life that there are so many times when I've said, you know what? I just got to let my subconscious chew on this. And the only way to do that is to walk away. And I'm the same as you. I can't I writing is my job and I can't write every day, especially on the same project. It just doesn't work for me because so much of it does happen when you're not thinking about it, when you're just letting it be on the back burner of your brain. Just like trust that your mind is going to think about it while you're not actually actively thinking about it.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, I think that's really good advice is to just like allow your subconscious room to do its thing.
Yeah.
And don't panic if you're not coming up with this immediate thing, an immediate answer. It's like, well, just give it some time.
Yeah,
Puzzle over it.
exactly.
Yeah.
Ben in the chat just said that he gets lots of ideas and plot twists when he's doing the dishes.
Yeah.
And that's the thing, like I think it's important to not worry about having to do, boring stuff like cleaning the house or whatever, because actually you can use that as time for thinking through your story, and it's like invaluable because when you get back to the page, you're going to have a whole load of stuff that you wouldn't have had if you'd just been trying to write the whole time.
Yeah.
And whether that's doing some chores or going for a walk,
Yeah.
or even just having a
Walking.
sleep, just having a sleep, you'll be completely stuck on something, go to sleep, wake up the next day, and you're like,
Yeah.
I know what
I
to
think
do.
it's not to be, I'm not tech averse, but I will say times when you can't have your phone on you are very handy for that reason.
Yeah,
For me, when I'm walking the dogs or doing gardening or whatever, and it's like my phone's in my pocket, there's nothing I'm not holding it. I can't look, can't be scrolling. That's when the brain is most active, when you're doing
mhm,
something else and it can be chewing on the other stuff in the background.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And something, I listen to a lot of podcasts,
Mhm.
particularly if I'm out for a walk, but sometimes I'll deliberately not listen to anything, so that my brain can just percolate stuff and and see what falls out.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And also, I
brains are
will
weird.
say to that point, I actually do think there's use in digesting nonfiction for the same reason. I
Yep.
find that there are times when I'm reading either poetry or like history or other nonfiction stuff, and it not that I'll get a direct answer from that thing, but just I think our brains just like to have a change up of diet when we're writing fiction. And when you do that, you're more likely to come up with other out of the box ideas, which is
Yeah.
why I personally can't read things in the genre that I'm writing while I'm writing,
Hmm.
because I find that not that the solutions become too rote, but it's more just like I don't want to accidentally imitate that. I'd much rather find another way to do it or a different tone maybe, or like approach it from a different angle. And yeah, I think personally I just can't, I find that difficult to read fiction while I'm writing fiction, but nonfiction can be really handy.
Yeah, and I think the broader your like influences and references and things that you're learning from, the better, really. So yeah, if you're a fiction writer, don't just read fiction in your own genre, read it in other genres. Don't just read fiction. Like go and watch some movies or go
Yeah.
see stuff on stage, or as you say, non-fiction, read the news, read some magazines, because it all goes in there and comes out in
Yeah.
a weird new shape.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, uh, what else? Yeah. So while we're still stuck in the middle, this is also I just jotted down, like, be aware of plot holes because this is where you
Mm.
fall in them. I know we've been saying, don't stress too much about what's coming up. Just focus on the chapter you're doing at this particular point. But also, I think the thing from my point of view is to be aware of how many, not plot holes, but how many plot points or character points you're introducing.
Right.
Because each thing you introduce, like, you have to deal with it somehow. So you either like ignore it and pretend it and hope it goes away, or you have to give it a resolution of some sort. Um, and if let's say you've got 20 chapters left, if you suddenly introduce five new major subplots and a whole bunch of new characters, then that could be a problem, or it could be a tricky thing, because how are you going to satisfyingly do anything with them? So kind of be aware of where you are in the project overhaul, as a whole, just in terms of like how much you're expanding, and knowing when you then have to actually like contract the story
Yeah.
back towards an ending of some sort. Which doesn't mean giving everything like a happy ending or like a really neat
Sure.
uh, conclusion or something. But yeah, it's just knowing, uh, being conscious, I suppose, like making
Yeah.
deliberate choices about what you're adding to the story over time, and not overloading it.
Yeah, and I think it can be challenging to realize, because I've done it myself, where you get to the middle or three-fourths of the way through, and you realize that for whatever reason, because of the way you structured it, because of the way you plotted it, whatever, it's not quite what you wanted. It's not that it's bad necessarily, but it's just not quite the way you envisioned it in your head when you started. And just having a lot of grace for yourself and saying, you know what? Again, public first draft. Like, there's some subplots I really wanted to introduce and I can't. There's
Yeah.
some,
Yeah.
characters I really wanted to lean into and I can't. Like I don't have the bandwidth to be able to do that with this story in this way right now. However, the cool thing is nothing is permanent at this, as far as like you can now take once you finish it, it's finished and you can now take it and revise it and publish it yourself or do whatever you want to do with it. It's a public first draft. So like don't it's okay to grieve that. Like I know that sounds maybe a little bit over emotional, but sometimes it is a bit of a grief when you get through a project and you kind of go, it's not quite what I pictured and it's not quite what I wanted. And I know that, but nobody else knows that. I know that it wasn't what I wanted. Um, but forgive yourself for that. It's okay. Nothing's broken, nothing's ruined. It just means that you have space to explore that later now that you have a finished draft, which is exciting. That's an exciting thing. After you've taken some time away from it for a little bit, you can come back and you can change it up and do something fun with it. But yeah, trying not to uh, be too disappointed when things don't quite go the way you planned, because it
Yeah.
will happen.
And also constraints are good as well. So like having to exclude stuff. Like there's whole sequences and characters in Triverse that never made it into the serial at all.
Yeah.
For all sorts of reasons. Some of them practical, some of them story based. But sometimes excluding stuff can actually improve a story, even if you're like, oh, I really wanted to do that bit. Potentially not having some of those things can actually have a net benefit to the whole thing.
Yeah. And your readers won't know any different. So
No,
they'll
exactly.
take the story as it's
Exactly.
presented to them. So it's okay. Like they're not going to be disappointed. It's just you who's going to be feeling the feelings. So
Yeah, quite. My last point for this section of like being in the middle is don't obsess over the metrics, because I think this is when you can really get like drawn in into that side of things. So this is when you're going to be, you've got enough chapters and posts that you've put out that you can start looking at like how much did each one get read? How many new subscribers have come on board? Am I losing subscribers? What's going on? And depending on the platform you're on, you get a range of metrics and numbers. They're all slightly different, the different platforms. But the thing I think that's critical is to remember why you're doing it in the first place, and that you started doing this to tell a cool story. And if like one random person on the planet showed up to read it, that's pretty cool. Any more than that, even better. But like the point is to tell a cool story, whether or not like people are showing up for it to a degree. Whereas if you over time accidentally flip it around where you're like, oh, I need to get more people, I need to increase my subscriber count or something. Like if that becomes the reason you're coming back every week, you're probably going to end up quite miserable, I think.
I'm going to go ahead and pop a bubble that I feel like maybe a lot of people have. Serials don't tend to drive growth. They just don't. I can say that as someone who has done many of them. I'm not saying they don't drive any growth. I'm just saying if that's the reason you're doing this, potentially reassess. Because, like you said, the goal of writing a serial is to tell a compelling story to whoever shows up. And if you can go into it with that mindset, you will have so much more fun and really enjoy yourself. Metrics will destroy your motivation. They will absolutely ruin your motivation. Because they don't mean anything when it comes to the actual storytelling. Metrics are only good as pattern recognition for when you are creating some kind of business strategy. And I have used my metrics for that reason, for when I'm strategizing for various things. But while I'm writing a serial, like you said, I try really hard not to even look at the metrics because they just don't mean anything. And what they especially don't mean is value. Like the value of the story you're telling or your own personal value as an author has nothing to do with how many people are reading it. And it has nothing to do with how many people read last chapter versus this chapter. um, it just doesn't. So please, I am imploring people, do not use metrics as your motivator, because it will not sustain you. You're going to have an internal motivator that keeps you writing, that has nothing to do with how many people are reading at any given time. Because I will say, like, I'm very grateful to have a certain amount of subs at this point. That doesn't mean I've got thousands of people reading my serials at any given time. It really doesn't. And some are more popular than others, and some just really, if I'm looking just at the numbers, it'll just make me go, oh, why even bother? You know? And you
Yeah.
bother because you want to tell a good story. That's why you bother. That's why you do a serial, not because you want to grow in a particular way. Internal growth, not external growth. Let's put it that way.
Yes, exactly. And, cause I think where that, I don't know about you, Sally, but, I have a day job that is nothing to do with my writing. It's kind of in the creative industries, which is nice, but I have the day job and that's what financially supports me. And then I do my writing,
Right.
which is a fortunate position to be in. Not everyone is necessarily in that situation. And I suppose some people might be like, yes, but I want this to be my living. I want to write and have that be my income. Or, treat, if you're doing it down the newsletter route on Substack or something, I want to treat it like a business and I do want to grow and make it a sustainable thing. I think from my point of view, I would say if that's what someone wants to do, like, don't try and do it with serial fiction or fiction at all. Which sounds a bit negative, but like
Yeah.
there's much easier ways to make money, basically. Whereas if you're writing serial fiction or telling stories in any way, like, the telling of the story really has to be the point of doing it in the first place, because any other reason for doing it is just, it's highly unlikely to happen for a start, but it's also just going to make you miserable. So yeah, the story has to be the thing, and anything that comes as a result of it is cool bonus.
Yeah. Yeah. My, I can speak from the other side of that, which is my day job is being a freelancer, writing and editing. And I would love for Substack to be my full-time job. But it's part of my income. It's not a huge part of my income, but it is part of my income. I'm very grateful to my paid subscribers. It means a lot. What actually ends up happening, though, is that my serials form the backbone of my eventual publication. I'm a self-published author. So, you know, I write a serial and then I polish it up and I publish it. And that's my goal as an author, is for Substack to be this fun little playground where I get to do fun things and I get to experiment and I get to try. And then I get to take that and do what I want to do with it as a career. And so if you're putting all your eggs into the basket of people paying you for your fiction on Substack, I do think that will be a disappointing avenue initially. I think it should be seen as a place to play and a place. I don't know about you, Simon, but like, I think we've talked about this before. I have never finished so much as I have on Substack. Never in my creative life. And
Yeah,
so to me, that's the real benefit of Substack, is it is a playground. It's a place to have fun and then turn that fun into something that hopefully makes money. But this isn't the place to necessarily generate an income necessarily. It can, but
yeah,
not necessarily.
yeah. Go and write about politics and AI if you want to make loads of money on Substack.
You'll make
Um,
loads of money.
yeah, I mean, I think in next episode and maybe the one after it, we'll talk about this stuff in a bit more detail, because there are certain levers you can pull to
Mhm.
to interesting effect. But the central core, I think, in terms of what we're talking about and what I imagine most people watching are interested in, like, it has to be the serial fiction and the storytelling at the core of it. Um, Otherwise, madness will ensue one way
Yeah,
or the other.
nothing bad.
um, so we're running a bit over time. So appropriately, we are getting to the last section, which I called landing the plane,
Yeah.
and endings. And the plane metaphor is quite good because the key thing about like taking off in a plane, like the most important thing that you have to do is then land it again at some point.
Once it's in the air,
Otherwise,
it's got to come down.
otherwise it's a problem. And I think stories are, particularly long form serials, are a bit like that. And if you're writing as you publish, in particular, there's a target like way off over here somewhere that has been there from the very start, and you can't even see it at first, and then it starts. You see it on the horizon, but it's way off. You don't have to think about it, and then suddenly it's coming up really quick, and you have to like hit that target. And depending on the complexity and scale of the project, like with Triverse, I just kept thinking of like when NASA sends a probe up and it has to do these crazy orbits around different planets to then land on a particular asteroid that's traveling at like billions of miles per hour. And it's like, how did they calculate that? But sometimes writing a complicated bit of fiction and trying to end it to me feels a little bit like that. I don't know about you.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, even though I do like to start out knowing uh, pretty much where I'd like to end up. Like I think I mentioned in the last episode, I use kind of my own modified version of the Blake Snyder beat sheet, and something that has is sort of your opening image and your closing image, right, for your story. And so I like to have a closing image for my story. Unfortunately, by the time you reach the ending, other stuff has joined on, like other things. Like I said, I've pulled a couple of cards on Storymatic and some random characters showed up that I wasn't expecting, or a plot point needs to be resolved or whatever. And so, yeah, it can really feel like you're bringing all of that with you, barreling toward the end, and you go, ooh, okay, this is more than I thought I was going to have to deal with when I was just looking at this on an outline, So it's exciting, but a little scared.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I find it to be the hardest part of the whole process. Certainly with Triverse, it nearly broke me because I'd been writing it for like, I think the whole project was 4.5 years. So I'd been writing it for about just under 4 years when I could suddenly see the target, like the end point in mind. But being a really long, big thing, there was like a million characters and plot points roving about, and trying to like thread that all in. Whether I did it or not, I'll let other people decide. But the pressure of trying to do it was really difficult, and I found that like I couldn't really think of anything else for like 6 months to a year. Essentially, like I couldn't do any other creative projects. Getting out the sort of non-fiction newsletter was really difficult. It just felt like I had less brain space, basically. Just impacting every area of my life because it was just every moment was like, oh my God, how do I do this? So yes, it's very hard, which is why I think planning ahead even a little bit helps. Like if you're not really a planner, if you just kind of wing it as you go along, I would say if you're going to plan at any point, once the ending is kind of in sight, that's when you want to just like draw a little map between where you are and how you get there. Because particularly if you've got readers along for the ride and they've committed weeks or months or years to this thing that you've been doing, which is like a crazy privilege to have people do that, like you don't want to mess up the last little bit because it'd just be really sad.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I would agree with that. So like make sure that regardless of anything else. I also I'm pausing because I'm kind of going back and forth on whether this is a next week thing to talk or a next time thing to talk about or not. But I think it's relevant here that don't be persuaded to change up your ending uh based on whether people maybe have guessed your ending or
Or have
they're
wildly guessed the wrong thing.
yeah. Yeah, I think again we will elaborate on engagement with comments and stuff at a later date, but I think especially when you're talking about the ending, um as long as the target still works with what it is that you started with, and as long as you are wrapping up those thematic threads and your character motivations and all that stuff, do it anyway. Don't, you know, finish the story as written. Don't try to almost like litigate it in midair. Like, because I think that that can be a temptation for people who have had a lot of engagement or have had some feedback or have had people, again, like guess a twist maybe, and or either guess it correctly or guess it wrong. And like we have seen publicly in very large scale pop culture projects what happens when showrunners try to change things because the forums guessed what was going to happen, and it's like, don't do that. Let people have that one. If they guessed it, great. That means they were paying attention. Like, just land the plane, land it with panache, with a flourish, and yeah, don't feel like you have to outsmart anybody or be the cleverest one in the room. The point is to tell a good story. And also, again, I would say having grace for yourself if it isn't quite the way you wanted it to go. Again, like that's just finish the story as written rather than finishing a different story that you wish you had written. Um, that can be a little challenging to have in mind as you're going, but um, yeah, that's where I'd go with that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think everything we've said about trying to have your themes and your characters lead the story rather than the plot. I think if you've done that, then in my experience, having what have I done now? I've done 4 big serials, and having done it that way around, the ending so far I think has always worked because like if someone's been enjoying the story for its duration, it's because of the characters and it's because of the themes of the story. So as long as they stay true through to the end in some manner, I think the ending is then satisfying.
Yeah.
Um, and if that means like slightly changing the plot points or like the events that happen, that's fine because it's not really the events that people. It's why, like you're saying, if someone on an internet forum has guessed what's going to happen, or even if it's actually been spoiled, like if a film's coming out and then something leaks and everyone knows what happens, doesn't really matter because it's not actually the events that happen one after the other that is the thing that makes the story work. It's seeing the characters go through those events that give it kind of resonance and meaning. And until you actually watch the thing or actually read the thing, you don't get that, even if you know like the beat by beat plots. It's why reading a plot summary on Wikipedia is not at all the same as actually reading or watching a story. Like it's not the same thing. Because
Yeah, I think
it's missing all the bits that matter.
I think it's Flannery O'Connor who famously hated the way people taught literature in schools, and she was very vocal about that. But one thing she didn't like is that if you can separate out all these different things from a story, then it ceases to be a story. Like it has to be this. If you can just read the ending and then it works on its own, then it's not a story. Like you need to have all those component parts all working together to have that really powerful finish. And I won't I won't spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen it, but I will say that there's still an essay in me somewhere writing about why, in my opinion, Breaking Bad is one of the only shows that people bring up when they talk about ending well. And what I will say is, without spoiling anything, I believe it's because Vince Gilligan, as the showrunner, understood his character's motivations so powerfully that that final episode was like him bringing everything down to that core, right? And that obviously is a show that goes all over the map when it comes to all kinds of things going on. And I thought it was fully outlined beforehand. Apparently, according to the showrunners, it wasn't. They were writing it as they went. But I think, again, they just had a really strong sense of who these characters were and what they wanted, and also what was going to eventually happen to them. And that's what carried them through to just one of the most legendary finales of all time, right? And I think it's also the reason why so many shows fail is because they lose sight of that. And so by the time they get to the ending, they're just trying to finish, right? And guess what? There are some serials where you do get to that point where you're just like, I just need it to be over, like it happens. But as much as possible, I think if you're keeping that core alive, then even if certain subplots have fallen by the wayside or certain characters have disappeared and we don't know what happened to them or whatever. Landing it properly just includes understanding the core of why people were enjoying it in the first place. And it's because, like you said, it's because of the characters and because of what they were up to and the adventures they were going on. That's what we want to see. So,
Yeah. Yeah. And I
yeah.
think because by this point, there are so many, quite often there can be so many plot threads that are like active and in motion that when you get to the ending, it can end up feeling quite mechanical by accident if you're just trying to connect all these different plot points.
Yeah.
And it feels like an exercise in ticking a box rather than finishing a story. So yeah, it's figuring that out. Having said that, in terms of ticking boxes, one thing I did with Triverse, I think some of my previous series as well. When I was a fair distance out from the ending, I do sometimes just sit down with a bit of paper and write not exactly a checklist, but all the sort of plot points, character resolutions, thematic stuff that I've introduced during the course of the story, which I want to in some way wrap up. Just
Yeah.
as a little list of like, these are the things which I have to address in some way. Um, and it's not everything. Like a lot of stuff won't get resolved because you don't want a story to be too neat. But I think because, particularly if you're writing and publishing as you go along, like it's such an intense, rapid process that it is actually quite easy to forget stuff that you did want to put in. So taking that little time before you get to the sort of finale chunk of story, just being like, I must remember to do this, this, and this. And then you can thread that in a way that feels natural and give yourself enough time to do it so that it isn't like it's the last chapter and suddenly everything has to be like rearranged and done perfectly and then it's the end.
Yeah.
Like you can, because if you start the process early enough, people won't even realize the mechanics of it or the fact that you're entering the finale. To take another TV show, a lot of people didn't like the ending of Game of Thrones. And I think in the TV show, like part of that is to do with what specifically happened, but I think it's also just to do with the pacing of it because a lot of
Yeah.
the plot threads and character resolutions they ended up doing sort of happen in the last few episodes.
Yeah.
But if you stretched, like if you had exactly the same stuff happen, but you stretched it back like 2 seasons or something,
Give it more room.
yeah, then the exact same events could have worked a lot better. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's knowing when to start your ending is quite important.
I've actually, now it's funny that you're saying that because I'd forgotten I did this for the end of my second season of Freelance and Fishmates, which was a serial I was working on that ended up being 2 seasons long. I actually did something similar where I had note cards that I wrote. I did color coded note cards because I realized I had the same problem where I was like, I've got all of these subplots or all of these motifs that I started that I need to make sure I hit before I get to the end. And I arranged them on the floor because I had like 4 or 5 episodes left, and so I arranged them on the floor of which ones I wanted to hit on which episode as I was going, and I literally, like, piled them into those piles, and as I was writing, I just had the note card sitting in front of me like, "Okay, did that? Did I do that? Okay, whew, alright, next ones." Like, because I wanted to make sure that, like you said, that the pacing lands properly and that some of these things are wrapped up in a way that feels natural rather than just like, "Oh, no, it's the final episode, let's make sure that every character has been mentioned and that they're little like at the end of those, teen dramas where it's like so and so went on to become a thing and then so and so did this and there's like you don't need
Yeah,
that. Like you can kind of, seed this into the ending instead more naturally.
yeah, yeah. Or you end up with a like a Return of the King situation where your film has 10 separate
Multiple
endings,
endings.
one
Yeah.
after the next. It's like, not sure this is entirely right, but
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Um, and then the last stuff I've noted down for like the ending is to indulge yourself a bit and like celebrate it. And like writers can be quite shy generally, I think, but if you've just written and completed, or I'm about to complete a major serial project, like tell everyone you know, basically, like shout about it because it's a cool thing and it's a big achievement. And if you're doing it through a newsletter or a platform like Substack or something, like talk to people about it because it's a cool thing and other people will be probably quite interested in what you've done as well, whether or not they've been reading it along the way. Because you should. I think it's okay to be proud of completing a major project like that. And like you were saying about how you've been more productive since having a newsletter than you ever have before. Like I've had the same thing. Like when I used to write on Wattpad, that's kind of where I got started with that. But then since coming to doing my own newsletter, like the amount of writing I've done, and I record audio and put podcasts out, and get to do cool collaborations like chatting with you. There's so much going on that I don't think any of it would have happened. Well, definitely none of it would have happened if I hadn't started writing serial fiction and serial fiction specifically, because that's what enabled me to build a habit and get past that the hump, the 20,000 word like thing where I get distracted by a new shiny project and never quite finish anything. Like all of the fun, exciting, creative things that I've done in the last 10 years, like they all came about because of that initial project where I was like, oh, I might try doing a serial. That sounds fun. And then all the other stuff happened in a very unpredictable kind of way. But yeah.
Yeah, I agree that I can be very I can be guilty of being very on to the next when it comes to projects. And I think one of the reasons I've cultivated that is because I don't want to obsess too much about, whether something's been received in a particular way or how popular something is. So I kind of go like, that's okay. I'm just going to move on to the next thing. The downside of that is that it is good sometimes to stop where you are and look back over the project you've just done and go, I just did that. That's something that was not in the world several months ago or whatever. And now it is. And now I can be excited about that. And I can do whatever I like with that work, or even just let it be what it is. You don't have to do anything with it. You can just let it be. Yeah, it's good to celebrate those things. And also, I will point out there are some people who do not prefer to read things as they're being serialized. They prefer to binge at the end. So if you finish something, make sure you tell people, because there are some folks who will be like, I have been waiting for you to finish so I can finally read this, and I think that's important too. Because some people are just not a big fan of waiting week to week. And I think they would prefer to just read the whole thing as it's out. So
Waiting for the box set.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So make sure you let them know. Otherwise, how will they know?
Exactly. Yes. And that's kind of the perfect segue into the next part of this that we're going to be doing, which is all about letting people know. We'll be talking about audiences, engagement, comments. What does that mean? How do you get it?
Dreaded feedback.
Yeah. How do you get past the sense that you're shouting into the void, which I think most people have experienced one way or the other? Where do you find readers? I'm not saying we've got magical answers to any of this, by the way, but we'll have some thoughts and suggestions. So yeah, it's very much on the kind of the audience end, and what do you do about that? Both if the audience doesn't show up, what do you do about it? And also if they do show up, what do you do about it? Because they're both interesting, slightly different challenges.
Exactly.
Yes. And how to handle Scoot if he shows up is, I don't have an answer for that, actually.
Nobody does.
No, indeed. But yeah, we'll wrap it up there, I think, for today. So thank you everyone for coming along. There's been lots of chatting in the chat.
Yeah, this has been a good one. Thanks, everybody.
I don't think we've got a date for the next one yet, but we will aim to get it in the calendar in the next couple of weeks at some point. And if you've just come in towards the end of this, we will be putting the recording up. I don't even know what day of the week it is, but at some point. Yes.
Wednesday for now.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. Thanks, Sully.
All right. Thank you.
See you at the next one.
Pleasure as always.
Right
Bye.
then. Bye, everyone.